Hi, and welcome to Between the Rows. My name's Dave, and I'll be your host this week. In a very broad sense, we're mostly going to be talking about land use practices and ways to demystify those. First up is conservation agreements, which are meant as a long-term way to protect the natural aspects of a given piece of land. Today we're going to take a bit of a tour of one such piece of prairie whose owners want to keep it in nature and nothing but.
When we go, I just want this place to stay as is, and maybe a future generation be able to enjoy this.
Also, one of the biggest names in potato processing says it's hoping to help growers in Canada and elsewhere take some of the uncertainty out of adopting regenerative ag practices.
Where we have a regenerative practice in a certain region where we're not sure about the economic return or the impact on soils, that's where McCain wants to come forward and provide funding and help de-risk that practice to get that data set so that in that region, that grower base is really comfortable with that adoption because they've seen that data year over year.
And one of our reporters has been spending a lot of time covering the supply chain issues deviling the ag sector, and she'd like to see policymakers get more serious about a chunk of that chain that's been kind of dragging loose on the ground for some time now.
There weren't enough truckers to begin with. And those shortages may have hit the limelight now, but the transportation sector had been ringing this alarm for years.
All that's coming up on Between the Rows right after this.
Farm kids are fortunate. We inherit the land and the lessons that come with it. The lessons are more valuable. I learned early on while chopping thistle on our Kansas cattle farm the value of hard work. I use this every day at Case IH. Because if it's valuable, you pass it on. My name is Ryan. I am a farmer, and I work for Case IH.
Case IH, built by farmers.
Welcome back. To start, we're going to pay a visit to Delta Marsh, an area at the south end of Lake Manitoba, which ranks 14th on the list of Canada's biggest lakes. The marsh has been deemed a wetland of international importance and is a wildlife management area protected against any significant resource development. Of course, there's a whole lot of lucrative farmland nearby, though, and in that region, there's some pristine habitat, where Don Norman of the Manitoba Co-operator takes us now.
When you hear people say, well, if this is gone, the birds can go somewhere else. Well, can they? If enough of this goes on? I mean, at some point in time, like areas like this, habitat like what we have, it's finite.
Nestled on the southern edge of Lake Manitoba's Delta Marsh, there's a rustic sliver of paradise. The tract sits on 31 acres of wetlands, grasslands, and forest. This richly diverse ecosystem provides a home to countless species of wild animals and birds, as well as two humans, Cal and Elaine Cuthbert. Cal has that fit, ageless quality you'd expect from a retiree who spent his life going on nature walks.
My wife Elaine and I, we own the property here. There's 31 acres of riparian habitat, wetland, and growback meadow. And I happen to grow up in this particular site here. We're fourth generation Cuthbert. 1884 was when one of the first title was laid on this property here.
Cal and Elaine recently signed a conservation agreement with the Nature Conservancy of Canada that will preserve the property's natural habitats for future generations.
We're not going to be here forever. Unfortunately, we like to think we're going to be here forever, but that's not the way the world turns. Let's, I'd hate to see something happen to this property. The trails, the wetlands, the cattail, the oak, the beauty of it, deer, the different species of birds. When we go, I just want this place to stay as is, and maybe a future generation be able to enjoy this. So we started thinking, and I know my parents have talked about Nature Conservancy Canada.
The conservation agreement is a voluntary legal contract between the Cuthberts and the NCC that sets restrictions on the land's title. So whether they leave it to another generation or sell it, the natural value of the land will be sustained.
Well, it's a caveat. It's registered on our title. I mean, I own the land, I own the property, pay taxes on it, and all that other good stuff. So it's actually my property. It's just that the caveat that Nature Conservancy Canada has placed on it has stipulations that they and myself and Elaine have agreed to. Most importantly, at some point in time, the bush can never be pushed down. Okay, that's kind of a no-brainer there. The wetland can't be compromised in some way that would negatively impact its, water quality or whatever, its function as a wetland. And I want the grow back meadow, like I was mentioning earlier, it's about 8 acres of, it was cultivated at one time. It was pasture at one time. And we're letting it grow back into natural habitat right now. So we don't want that compromised either. So yeah, it's a great thing. I mean, we have the yard site here. It's ours to do as we please. And I got the trails. It's everything that we agreed to beforehand. Like, there's no surprises on this. Like I say, I don't want somebody going in there and cutting wood or just knocking wood or negatively impacting it in any way. So that's the whole idea of the conservation agreement. And just touching on the perpetuity thing, I think, some people think, oh my gosh, perpetuity, that's a long time. It is a long time, which is exactly what a conservation easement, a perpetuity conservation easement is all about. I don't want something for 5 years. I don't want something for 10 years. I don't want something for 20 years. When we're gone from here, somebody, purchases a property, and abracadabra, what happened to all the bush? So it's a natural fit, perpetuity.
Can you talk a little bit about how you became a nature enthusiast?
Well, I think growing up at the south end of Lake Manitoba with a literally world-renowned Delta Marsh as almost my backyard, it's really hard not to have an interest in nature as you're growing up. Maybe I took it one step further with, the birds and so forth like that. But it was just a wonderful, amazing area to grow up out here. I was an avid hunter at one time, waterfowl hunter. And, it's just, you have so many opportunities to really appreciate what this area has to offer growing up beside a huge wetland, freshwater marsh like Delta Marsh. Like I said earlier, it's very well known for its waterfowl studies, and it's all kinds of information on the natural world have been gleaned from this huge marsh out here. So yeah, I guess that's one thing led to another, and I've never looked back. I keep lists of birds. In fact, some people think I keep lists of lists, but which I probably do. But
it's one thing to hear Cal talk about his love for nature, but it's quite another to walk through it with him. As he prepares for our walk, he puts on a newsboy cap to shield his neatly cropped white hair from the rain and hangs his trusty binoculars around his neck. And he knows every tree in that forest. The ancient oaks, the ash, and the remnants of his great-grandfather's orchard. He greets the wildlife as he would his neighbors. He registers mild annoyance with a local buck who rubbed his antlers on a young tree, cutting short the sapling's life.
I mean, it's a great place to walk. You can walk through some really nice wooded areas. I could add that some of the wooded area is composed of, oaks. We have a really nice mature oak stand. Some of these trees are 200 years, maybe some of them a little bit in excess of 200 years. They've been around for a long time. And, it's when you think, a couple 100-year-old tree, I mean, some of these trees were around when this place was, there were bison still moving through some of this area. And if, there are some oak trees that are in excess of 300 years, not necessarily on this property. But when you think about it, like the passenger pigeon, I guess you don't really have to be a bird enthusiast, but most people have heard of passenger pigeons, which are now extinct. you're looking at a 300-year-old tree. Well, passenger pigeons could have been landing on those trees or even nesting on them. So it's pretty awesome trees. I like trees. Tree hugger, possibly, but I think trees are pretty special. I mean, they're you go walking through some of these trails here, and it's well, I guess spiritual may be a little overreach for some people, but it is a very peaceful feeling, especially when you have, birds singing or migration birds passing through. You might put up a mule, actually we do have a mule deer hanging around here, if you can believe it or not, but a white-tailed deer, or maybe there's a woodchuck out here, or it's just eastern cottontail rabbit, snowshoe hares, short-tailed weasel. I mean, I've recorded 40 species of mammals on this property, and that's not bad. Yeah. But I mean, it's just the opportunity to, put my shoes on and go for a walk. I don't have to hop in a car and drive 20 minutes or an hour or 2 hours to get to a place like this. I look out the window and I start walking through the trail, and there it is. I mean, it's all here, and I want people. I want future generations, somebody somewhere somehow, to experience what my wife and I are experiencing right now. I mean, it's special.
You've been hearing Don Norman, a reporter with the Manitoba Co-operator, in conversation with Southern Manitoba resident Cal Cuthbert. You're listening to Between the Rows, and I'm your host this week, Dave Bedard. So McCain Foods, one of the best-known Canadian food processors with operations worldwide, just recently completed the first year of operations on the first of what it calls Farms of the Future in its home province of New Brunswick, and just recently launched its second Farm of the Future on the other side of the planet, both with the goal of helping to prove the business case for sustainable farming. For more on how that's going, you can have a listen here to Jess Newman, McCain's Senior Director of Agriculture and Sustainability, in conversation with our reporter, Liam O'Connor.
Jess, could you start by explaining what the Farms of the Future project is?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with McCain's sustainability goal around agriculture, which is the genesis of all of this. So last year, McCain committed that by 2025, we would launch 3 Farms of the Future that would be our commercial scale regenerative test laboratories, essentially. This is all in support of McCain's second goal, which is supporting 100% of our growers in transitioning and implementing regenerative agriculture on their potato acreage by 2030. So what our Farms of the Future do is, again, they're commercial, full-scale, full rotation regenerative potato farms that basically are aiming to prove out both the economic and agronomic business cases of specific priority regenerative practices. Last year, we announced that our first farm would, of course, be in Florenceville, in the hometown of McCain Foods, our first Farm of the Future. And we just had a really successful year there. And I can say a bit more about that if you're interested. But this week, we're really excited to announce that our second Farm of the Future will be in South Africa, a very different growing region from New Brunswick.
Could you describe some of the challenges and differences with opening a farm in South Africa?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the first difference is simply that, potato farming looks really different in both of these places. In both, New Brunswick, where our first farm is, and in Lichtenberg, where our second farm will be in South Africa, we already work with contract growers, right? And so the Farm of the Future is a McCain-owned full-scale regenerative pilot farm. And so we know the region well. We have factories in South Africa. We work with growers there. We have an agriculture team that supports our growers with both field representatives and agronomists. So it's more about really just identifying those priority practices in partnership with our growers that we want to trial on the farm. Now, 2 weeks ago, I just finished visiting our first Farm of the Future in New Brunswick. And it was amazing to see the practices that they had prioritized and the progress they'd really made in only 1 year. So the priority practices there were diversifying rotations, minimizing tillage intensity, controlled traffic, which was super interesting to see the impacts that was having. I'm forgetting one, cover cropping, and rotational grazing. And we know that investments in soil health can take, 10 years plus to really show up in organic matter. But even the differences in compaction between kind of a conventional system and the regenerative approach on the farm of the future were really apparent after only 1 year.
How do the farms stand to benefit farms in Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, so I think that the first question that folks asked when we announced our 100% regenerative commitment in our Farms of the Future goals was why? And ultimately, it's because we know that climate change is really an existential threat to the potato industry in the US and Canada, where McCain's agriculture team operates. We see that in frosts that come early or that come late, in precipitation events that are larger than we expected, or at times when we didn't expect them, in scorching heat when we usually wouldn't see it, in cold springs when we wouldn't expect them. In some of our regions at this point, we're planning for a crop failure every 2 years. And we know that that is devastating to the grower bottom line and all the way through the McCain supply chain to our consumers. So our investments in regenerative agriculture are about investments in building soils, which we ultimately know build on farm resilience. So this is about supply chain security at the end of the day. So how do we want to partner with growers? So our goal is to be in partnership with our growers 100% of the way on our regenerative agriculture journey. So what that means is that we work with growers to develop our framework for how we measure a regenerative potato acre. In fact, we're releasing that publicly this week for even more feedback from growers and industry. We're working with the Soil Health Institute to launch soil health roundtables in each of our Canadian regions, where we align with our growers on major challenges and the next steps, the priority practices that they want to pilot. And then McCain sees our goal as de-risking those practices, right? Where we have a regenerative practice in a certain region where we're not sure about the economic return or the impact on soils, that's where McCain wants to come forward and provide funding and help de-risk that practice to get that data set so that in that region, that grower base is really comfortable with that adoption because they've seen that data year over year. So that's kind of how we see our role. And I think, why we hope Canadian producers are going to be really excited about this.
Where are the 3 new farms going to be located?
So our commitment is for 3 farms of the future total. So we've got New Brunswick, South Africa now. Our next one will be announced next year. It probably will be abroad. Globally, we work with growers who are farming 370,000 potato acres in systems that are very diverse. So making sure that we're kind of spreading the love. But we know that a farm of the future in New Brunswick, might not be as relevant to our growers in Alberta or Manitoba, right? So then how are we making sure that we're still having that learning laboratory and those learning hubs? Well, we're going to be partnering with our growers for growers who are willing to have some of their fields serve as those model hubs or demonstration farms where they're going to test priority practices, agree to host field days, share the data that come off them. So it's kind of like a farm of the future light model in our other regions because we know how critically important it is to prove out these practices in each location.
Regenerative farming is a holistic approach to farming. So what was McCain's approach?
Yeah, so when we announced our regenerative commitment last year, the people asked, well, what does that mean? Which is a good question. So this week, we're really proud to announce our regenerative agriculture framework, which is basically the list of criteria that an acre would need to meet in order for us to call it a regenerative potato acre. So you think about all the different principles of regenerative ag, keeping living cover on soils, minimizing tillage, creating biodiversity and habitat, minimizing and optimizing use of synthetic inputs. When you kind of go down that list, our framework says, okay, what would an acre need to be doing to be at beginner level, at master level, and expert level? So we can give an example for, maintaining living cover on your soil. Beginner level would be 90 days, you've got something alive in the soil. But master might be 180 and an expert might be 260, right? So it's a framework where growers can look at all the different principles, identify which ones they're excited about trialing on their farm, and then kind of move forward through those progressive steps of going from beginner through to expert. Now, we know that a number of our growers are already absolute experts at regenerative agriculture, are trialing many different things. And we know that in each region, the areas of strength and opportunity on that framework are actually very different. So it's all about that tailored regional action planning and working with growers on what practice is the next frontier where it's not proven yet, and how can McCain come in and support there.
Were there any specific areas of success you noticed at the farm?
Yeah, it completely varies by region. So for example, one of the key tenets of our regenerative framework is having at least 1 in 4 in terms of your rotation for how many times the potato crop comes up on a given piece of ground. And we have some regions like Alberta where the average grower is 1 in 6, right? And so those wins are totally different by region. And that's amazing, right? So those strengths are different by region, and then those opportunity areas are different by region. If you're talking about a 1-in-6 rotation in New Brunswick, people are going to say, we wish we had that, right? And so for us, it's then understanding what are those priorities in each region and how do we support moving the needle forward, understanding that this is a long-term commitment, that we have 8 years, and that we really need to take the time to do this right. We are only interested in supporting that our growers adopt practices that have both an agronomic and an economic benefit. This has to be financially sustainable for everyone. We have to be able to remain profitable. At the same time, we know that inaction on climate change is also a threat to profitability, right? So it's finding that balance.
Thank you for joining us today, Jess, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you so much, Liam. Have a good weekend.
You've been hearing Glacier Farm Media's Liam O'Connor in conversation with Jess Newman of McCain Foods. You're listening to Between the Rows. I'm your host this week, Dave Bedard. We're going to take a bit of a step over from the sustainability of agriculture to the sustainability of our supply chains now. And Alexis Stockford, a reporter with the Manitoba Co-operator, has some thoughts on that matter.
Agriculture has a trucking problem. Now, it's no news that farms need truckers to conduct their business, but lately those truckers are in short supply. Now, in early January, I started covering transportation shortages in the pork sector. And at the time, Omicron cases were riding a wave, drivers and wash station staff were out sick, and some drivers were going to fall on the wrong side of a vaccine mandate. But it quickly became obvious that there was a wider story that needed to be told. There weren't enough truckers to begin with. And those shortages may have hit the limelight now, but the transportation sector had been ringing this alarm for years. Now, I heard about this problem from farm groups, from egg retailers, from university professors, freight company owners, from driving schools. And so the story became, why is there a shortage in the first place, and what was being done to fix it? When I started, I expected to find perhaps a working group, maybe a government department taking this on, some sort of focused, overarching effort to tackle this issue, given the truly society-spanning stakes of the problem. But the reality came across as much more of a patchwork. The provincial government, for example, bounced my media request around to 4 departments, ranging from labor to transportation infrastructure, to advanced education, skills and immigration, to the Department of Economic Development, Investment and Trade. There seemed to be real debate over who should speak to me, or who was even responsible to speak to me. And in the end, there was no interview, just a general response that financial help was available for trucker training. And when it came to initiatives that would hopefully see more drivers on the road, whether they were spearheaded by industry or government-led, answers were not easy to find. Even though there was general agreement that this was a huge problem affecting a key sector of our economy, it led me to title one section of the article, "Who's Holding the Ball?" Because it seemed like no one really knew. And it seems to me that until we can answer that question, we can expect these trucker shortages to continue.
You've been listening to Alexis Stockford of the Manitoba Co-operator, and you've just heard our show for the week. Many thanks to Alexis and to our reporters Don Norman and Liam O'Connor, and to our producer Bruce Thorson, who's been assembling these great soundscapes for us. And thanks also to our guests, Cal Cuthbert and Jess Newman. This has been Between the Rows, and I've been your host this week, Dave Bedard. Thanks for listening.
When you step foot on my farm, you become a part of it. I will tell you all about my land, what's working, what's not, as if we've spent our whole lives together. Our passion for farming makes us a community, and as part of that community, I want to see us all be successful, whether I'm working on your farm or with my job at Case IH. My name is Kelsey, I'm a farmer, and I work for Case IH.
Case IH, built by farmers.